Hey everyone, my name is Rooster and welcome back to Mechabellum. This video marks the start of a multi-part series that I want to do on unit counters, and today we'll be starting with small units. So what we'll be covering, we'll be going through crawlers, fangs, hounds, wasps, and mustang. Basically all of the units that come in a bigger group, maybe apart from hound, but it's a 100 cost unit that comes in a pack of 5, so I still wanted to include it in today's video. How this is going to work is that we're going to go through each of them, and then we're going to be talking about best counters and OK counters, which I have marked with an S for best and B for OK. And then it's going to be all about whether it's in a long range situation, so both of you are playing around the towers, or if it's a short range situation where at least one of you will be playing near the line, because this does matter somewhat in the options that'll be available to you. Anyway, let's get into this, and I hope that it'll all be clear once we get started. Alright, so here we are, starting with crawlers and counters for them in long-range scenarios. The first counter I have there in the S tier column is obviously going to be the Arclight. Arclights are fantastic against crawlers in general. They are easy to afford, you can get them on round 1, and they'll perform well throughout the game with techs like range or elite, and they can pretty much keep up. Vulcans, of course, will be here as well. They're a bit more expensive, but they are the giant of choice against pretty much any small unit, and they will perform very well if you can get your hands on them. And then in the B tier column, I have put Stormcallers with the incendiary tech. I think that this is quite useful. It can perform very well, but it usually needs a little bit of setup or a little bit of help from something like Arclights to deal with whatever crawlers may come through. Obviously, Subterranean Blitz can be clicked on crawlers, which might make things a bit more difficult. Either way, I put it there because it's helpful, but it's usually not enough in and of itself. Alright, that is crawlers long range. Let's move on to crawlers short range. Here we are. This one has a few more options, as you can see, because you're going to be in a short range scenario, so you'll have other units available that don't necessarily need to have a whole lot of base range. This is going to include Hound. This is going to include Spider, Wraith, and Fire Badger. All of these have a bit shorter range, but they perform really, really well, and they often perform even better or more efficiently because they have less range, right? Basically, like their stats are better for chaff clearing because they have to give up some of their range for it. Now, Hound is really good into Crawler. You do need some levels, and you will probably need to click range and mech range, but it performs incredibly well, even better than something like Arclight, often in terms of clear speed. Tarantula is fantastic as well. You can get your hands on it usually in the early game. It's a bit harder to get into later, but it does do exceptionally well as a chaff clear unit, and it's something that we'll see more of in this short range category. Wraith is very, very potent too. It's one of the best chaff clear units in the game, potentially even the best, because the way that its guns work allow it to never really get stuck. You'll always be looking for multiple targets, and it's a fantastic tool on both offense and even on defense to deal with big flanks that include crawlers, pushes that include crawlers, or if you're pushing in and your opponent has a lot on defense. Fire Badger is a good option too, but it's harder to get your hands on because it is a mercenary unit right now, and so you can't always buy it, but out of a drop, or if you're Fire Badger specialist, it can perform really well. I've put Arclight in B tier because it will do well in the early game, but Arclights don't chaff clear very quickly, which is usually what you want in short range scenarios, so in the long run you'll often need something else, and that's why I put it in B tier for now. Alright, that covers normal crawlers. I will now talk about loose formation crawlers, which is the tech that you'll see here on the right. This can get clicked, and when it does get clicked, it does somewhat change the options that are available to you, and I want to cover them. So here we go. Alright, starting with loose formation crawler being clicked in a long range scenario. Here, your best option in long range is going to be Vulcan. So the Arclight is now gone. It doesn't perform well against loose crawlers at all. It's kind of like Shielded Fangs, which we'll talk about as well. But Arclights just don't like this, and they will need some help. Vulcans, however, don't really mind. You can play them either with something like range, or you can try and click something like Incendiary Bomb, maybe even Incendiary and Oil Bomb, Fire is quite potent, which is why you'll see Incendiary Stormcaller in there as well. Again, in the B tier column, reason is that you won't be able to cover fire everywhere with Stormcallers. They might get intercepted, so they'll often need a little bit of extra help, which is why I put them there in B. Mustangs now show up as well. I'm not the biggest fan of Mustangs in long range because they can only get up to 135, I believe, with the range tech, which is a little bit tricky when you're up against long range units like Vulcan, which can get more, right? So it's not ideal, but it will do the trick because loose formation crawlers obviously lose some of their hit points, 40%, and that makes it easier for Mustangs to deal with them. So I do want to highlight them here. Let's move on to loose formation in a short range scenario. So here we are. We have loose formation in a short range. And you'll see you have lots of options available here because, again, it unlocks the potential for a lot of units that have a low base range. Now, Mustang is going to be an S tier because it performs better, in my opinion, in shorter range engagements because itself is kind of like an intermediary range unit, right? It doesn't have 100 base range, it has 95, and that can make it tricky in the longer range scenarios, but it does do very well into loose formation on short range comps. Tarantula also is well equipped to deal with this, but you will need to click high explosive, and I highlighted it here because I think it is absolutely mandatory on that unit if you want to deal with loose formation. Fire Badger will be there as well. Again, same story. Harder to get your hands on, but can perform well. Also has access to something like Napalm, which will allow you to set the ground on fire and deal with the crawlers more efficiently. Wraith, I want to put in S tier as well. It has some trouble with loose formation because it has got some splash inherently, which it can't make good use of when loose formation is clicked. But with 8-gun and the range tech, it still will do really well. And it's such a good shaft clear unit in short range scenarios that I can't leave it out of the S tier group. Now for the OK options, I will put Typhoon and I will put Hound. The reason that I put Typhoon here is because I don't like it that much as a shaft clear unit. Yes, it can do it, but it will often need levels and it's a tricky unit to play. So it's a bit like Mustang, but I think Mustang is easier to pilot and does a better job than the Typhoons will. So it can work, but it's not my first recommendation. Hound also can do well, but you will need levels again, and you will need mech rage and range. But it does perform a lot better into loose formation than something like Arclight, which is also a 100 cost shaft clear unit. Alright, hope this helps. That is crawlers covered. Let's move on to Fangs. So here we are. Again, it's going to be the same thing. First, we're going to cover long range and short range for normal Fangs, and then I'm going to be talking about Fangs with shield. So, long range Fangs, what do you want to buy? Stormcallers are going to be fantastic. Fangs are slow, so they're much easier to hit, and early Stormcallers will often, well, find their targets and help you out a lot to deal with a heavy Fang board. Vulcans, again, kind of the king of chaff clear. Doesn't matter whether it's Crawler or Hound or Fang. It'll do well, so if you can get your hands on them, they should do well against heavy Fang boards. In the B tier column, I put Arclight and Mustang. Arclight I put here because I'm not talking about shielded Fangs just yet. If you're just dealing with Fangs without shield, Arclight will do pretty well into them, right? At that point, they're kind of like crawlers and they will get one shot, so Arclights do a fine job. You just have to be a little bit careful about the eventual Fang shield showing up, so that's why I'm putting it in B tier and not in S tier. Mustangs will also be here. They're fantastic against Fangs, but same reason again, in standard, they can sometimes struggle against the longer range options. If your opponent has leveled Arclights with Elite, they will get outranged. If they have Vulcans, they will get outranged. If there's fire on the ground, they might walk through it. So it is good, but in a long range scenario, can struggle. Let's move on to short range Fang options. And again, you will see here more options are available. You will find the Hound. Hound, kind of a short range unit, but does really well against Fangs. Can just one-shot them at equal level, and so is a great option against Fang boards. Tarantula, you will see again, probably one of the better chaff clear options available to you, and has a host of techs that will help you chaff clear even more efficiently. Mustang has been bumped up, short range, it likes, so there it is. Again, Fire Badger, Wraith, and Typhoon this time around also will be showing up. All of these pretty much short-range units, but they are very, very capable, and they should do well into heavy Fang boards. Now, next up, we're going to talk about shielded Fangs, because usually this tech is why people build Fangs, right? They build a whole lot of Fangs and they threaten to click this. So how do you deal with it? In a long-range scenario, your options are going to be pretty much the same. This time around, I will recommend Stormcaller with at least the Incendiary Bomb. Having that lingering fire to have the slow Fangs walk through is going to be quite helpful, and it's just a good option all around if you are playing a long-range fight. Vulcans, again, of course, will show up, and then in the B tier, I will still put Mustangs. Mustangs don't really care about the shields too much because of their high fire rate, but again, not necessarily made for a long-range engagement. As we then move on to the final Fang counters, this is going to be shielded Fangs in a short-range scenario. You will see the Tarantulas again with the high explosive tech. You will need to click high explosive. Without it, you're not going to stand a chance, but with it, it is a fantastic counter to this unit. Mustangs, again, short range, big thumbs up. They will do well. Fire Badgers, great. Wraith, quite good, and I will keep the Typhoons there because they're kind of like Mustangs, and they do perform a lot better into Fang than into Crawler, in my opinion. So, yeah, I will keep them in S tier. Again, Hound does get an honorary mention. It is in the B tier, but with range and mech rage, because of the high fire rate, it performs better than something like Arclight, as it does with loose formation, and so it can sometimes get the job done. So, that's Fangs covered. Let's now move on to the Hound. And here we are. These ones are going to be a bit shorter. I will only be going over regular Hounds, regular Wasps, and regular Mustang, so not as many options with all of the different techs. And we start with long-range Hounds. So what do you do if your opponent is playing Hounds and you are both playing kind of around your towers? Your best option, again, is going to be the Vulcan. The Vulcan will be your best friend against Chaff. That's pretty much a good rule of thumb. So if you can get your hands on it, it should do well. Sledgehammers, actually, I will put up here as well. They might not really be considered Chaff clear, but because Hounds are smaller unit packs, the Sledgehammers can do pretty well. They are also quite tanky, so the Hounds can get stuck on them, while the Sledgehammers can take them out in return. So I will mention these over here. Then in the B column, I will have Arclights. I think Arclights in long-range scenarios can do quite well into Hounds. Of course, they outrange them. They can scale with Elite Marksmen, so they can do well, but it's a bit of a tricky levels type of scenario, where if your Arclights level, you're fine. If they don't, you might get into trouble. Raiden I will also put here. Now, Raiden isn't a Chaff clear unit, but because Hound is a bit of a weird like class of like mid-sized 100 cost units, it can do well, because you will hit 3 of them guaranteed. If you have Chain or Fork, you can even hit more, and it can actually work pretty well. Raiden isn't necessarily made for long-range fights, but it can perform, so I wanted to mention it here, as it can be a solid option, and if it shows up from a drop and your opponent is heavily investing into Hound, it might be worth a pickup. Let's move on to Hounds in a short-range scenario. So here we are. As usual, more options. You will see, again, the spiders show up. I do want to put the high explosive here. It's not required, but it does just help Tarantula a lot, right? To me, Tarantula goes from like a B or C tier Chaff clear unit to an S tier Chaff clear unit. Just when you click the high explosive button, often paired with range, but it does do a lot better against Hound with that tech equipped. Fire Badger, again, will go here as well. I am putting it in S tier, but there is a bit of an asterisk here. If your opponent is running armor, you might run into trouble. Hounds are Fire Badgers are very low damage because they come in a pack of 3, so armor is very good against them. And if your opponent runs it, then please don't go for Fire Badgers. You're gonna run into trouble. But if they don't have it, then Fire Badger is fantastic. Wraith, also quite good. Is just great against all types of Chaff in short-range engagements, so I want to have it there as well. And then in the B tier, you will see Hound. Yes, I am going to tell you that Hound counters Hound, which is a bit weird, but it is somewhat true. Hound can just do well into itself, and so I want to put it in B tier, not in S tier, because I want to give you other options, but it can sometimes work. So if both of you are in a mirror, then your Hounds can deal with their Hounds, but it just becomes a bit of a who techs first, who has the more Hounds, who has the more levels type of game. Again, arc lights in a short range scenario, they're not the best, but they can do decently well, especially in the early game. You might have to pivot out of them or add something to your board, but I think that it does perform kind of alright, so I want to mention them. And again, we're going to see the Raiden as well, as we're passing through, I think, some rafters there in the garage. Raiden can do quite well, so I wanted to mention it as well. Let's move on to Wasp as the next small unit to counter. Here we are. So, Wasps in a long-range scenario, what are your options? Well, you don't have too many. It is pretty much going to be Mustangs. Yeah, like that's just it, really. Even though Mustangs aren't necessarily meant to fight in long-range scenarios, Wasps are also quite fast, so typically you will be able to get rid of them before your Mustangs die. Mustangs are just the counter to Wasp, so if ever you're in a scenario where you feel like, oh no, I need to deal with Wasps, then I would say buy Mustang. It's going to be your best friend. Farseer is also a mention here. It does do well, but if your opponent is heavily investing into Wasp, you might run into trouble. It does clear Wasps somewhat well, but it's nowhere near as fast as something like Mustang, so I wanted to keep it in the B column for now. Let's move on to short-range counters the Wasp. Now over here you have a few more other options. Again, you're going to see Mustang. I also added Typhoon because it is short-range and Typhoons can't get more than 100 range. Of course, they can click the temporary range button, but of themselves, they can't get past their base range. They don't have access to range tech. So they do well against Wasp, but it has to be a short-range engagement. I will mention Wraith as well in the B column, but there is an asterisk here as well, where it does great up until the Wasps are high level and have both the range and the anti-air tech. If that's what you're up against, then Wraith will probably die and not be able to do its job anymore. So it does really well into Wasp, apart from the scenario where range and AA are clicked and the Wasps are high level. But apart from that, it is a fantastic shaft gear option, so I still wanted to show it in here. I am realizing that I don't mention Fortress Anti-Air here, which is a good option, but I don't like it in and of itself. Usually I would want it to be paired with Mustangs. You can play it both in long range and in short range, but I would typically say pair it up with Mustangs, so that's why I haven't really mentioned it here, but it is another option. Alright, let's move on to the final unit that we're going to cover in this video, which is going to be Mustangs. Alright, we've arrived to the final unit that we want to counter, which is going to be Mustang. In the S tier, you're going to be finding arc lights. These are probably your best option in the early game. If your opponent starts out with Mustangs, arc lights are somewhat made to counter them. They have about the same base range, but they can outscale them in the long run because they have access to something like Elite Marksman, and that does help. So just a generally good option if you're facing Mustangs and both of you are playing around your towers. Again, I'm going to be mentioning Incendiary Stormcallers here as well. Fire is one of the main tools that you will have against Mustang. It can be somewhat unreliable, but if you can land it, then it's very, very strong. And that's also why you'll see Vulcan. Now, Vulcan doesn't need to tech incendiary bombs necessarily. You can, but it will also perform really well with just something like range. In the B tier, you will see Mustangs. This is a bit of a similar situation to Hound. Mustang does perform pretty well into Mustang just by virtue of being good into, well, almost everything, right? It's a jack-of-all-trades unit, so with the right levels and the right techs and items, it can do almost any role, which also means that it's pretty good into itself. I don't want to put it up in S just because it is the same unit, but it can work. You can mirror your opponent's Mustangs if you want to. Sledgehammer I will also put in here because it's a bit of a similar scenario to Hound. Of course, the Mustang pack is bigger, but it can struggle to deal enough damage to deal with Sledgehammers, especially if they're leveled or they've got something like a heavy armor item. They're just really good stall, and they can also somewhat help you with taking out the Mustangs. Let's move on now to the final situation, which is Mustangs in a short-range engagement. And this is what my recommendation looks like. So in the S tier column, I will put arc lights as well. Even though that it is short range, I think if you're up against Mustang, the arc light still will perform well, and it's probably going to be your only and or your best option in the early game if you are facing a early Mustang investment from your opponent. Tarantulas I will put up here as well. They can clear them very efficiently. This also includes, again, if you click high explosive, it's not needed. Sometimes range is enough, but it is always a nice addition if you have the money. And then on top of that, it's a very tanky unit, which is something Mustangs don't like to deal with. So it's a bit of a 2-for-1 where it's both too hard to kill for Mustangs, and the unit itself is made to take out small units like Mustang. I will actually put Mustang this time around in S tier in the short range engagement, even though it's the same unit, and I didn't do it with Hound. I think this is just kind of true. Like, Mustangs are pretty good, again, in short range scenarios where they don't have to worry too much about the late game getting outscaled by things like arc lights or other units that have more range, and they can just do really well into themselves. So I will put them here if you are playing short range. And then in the B tier, I will put Fire Badger. Yes, it does have access to napalm, and if the Mustangs drive through that, it's going to do really well. But Fire Badgers get outranged by Mustang, so that's why I don't want to put it in S tier. It's also, again, a special unit, so not very easy to get your hands on. Can perform well, but it's a bit levels dependent. If you have more levels on your Fire Badgers than they have on your Mustang, you might do fine. If that's not the case, you'll probably struggle. So that was all that I wanted to cover in this video. I'm going to be making more for all the other types of units. I hope that you enjoy this. Again, the way that I went about this is long range scenario means you are sitting at your towers, both you and your opponent. Short range is one of you is playing near the line. It can also be both, but at least one of you is playing near the line so that you are in a short range engagement. This will, again, impact the options that you have. All right. If you have any questions, please let me know down below. If you like this, leave a thumbs up. If you want to stay up to date with my latest content, please consider subscribing. And if you want to see me play live, check me out on Twitch. I hope this was helpful. And with that being said, take care, guys, and see you in the next video. Bye-bye.